Hello and welcome to the first in a series of our conversations about counterintelligence issues that we think are really important to bring to the general public. My name is Josh Opsfeld, and I am the Senior Executive for External Engagement here at the FBI's Counterintelligence and Espionage Division. And I'm joined by Mary, who is a Senior Intelligence Analyst with us, and Patrick, our Senior National Intelligence Officer for China. So before I dive into it with Patrick and Mary, we all agreed that it's really important just to start with a couple of key points to mention. And the first is that people go and travel to China every single day with little incident or no incident at all. Millions, perhaps tens of millions of people travel to China and they have a normal experience without experiencing any disruption or any issues. And I think that is really a very important point for people who are watching this to keep in mind. So there are concerns, we're going to address them, but just bear in mind that the vast majority of people don't experience anything that's out of the ordinary. And the second, and this is really a point I think it's important to remember before going to any country, which is that it is incumbent upon you, the traveler, to understand and respect the laws and also the social norms of any country that you're visiting. I think it's a matter of practicality and security, but it's also just a matter of respect, right? If people come here, we want them to understand American culture and America's laws, U.S. laws. Same thing goes when we travel overseas. Just keeping those 2 points in mind, I think, could really be very helpful for people as they are framing this, this thought, this question that they have about going to China. So with that, why don't we just dive into some questions here and get going? I thought maybe we could start with just some background and context for the current state of play in China, in particular for a layman sort of business or academic audience. People are looking to travel to China. Patrick, maybe you could just start us off with some of that and enlighten the rest of us.
Yeah, so China, you've got the second largest economy in the world. It makes sense that, the United States being the largest economy and the amount of research going on between our two countries, there's going to be a lot of natural business opportunities, academic collaborative opportunities. There's plenty of work to be done between our two countries that's very productive. So, you have incentives to work together. You have a lot of opportunities. The things that you have to keep in mind are that we have two very, very different systems. In the United States, it's pretty hands-off. As independent entities, you go off, you do your research, you do your business, and if required, the government has an opportunity to be part of that, but otherwise we don't. And everybody's protected by the Constitution here. In China, it's very, very different. There is Chinese Communist Party presence in almost all activities and some level of oversight. It is really a top-down system. And so you should have an expectation that the Chinese security apparatus will have an optic into what you do and that they report back to the Chinese Communist Party. If you run a business and it's large enough, you will have a Chinese Communist Party cell in that business as part of the legal structure there. So any expectation of privacy that you have in the United States, you should not have when you're in China. And I think that's important to keep in mind that scrutiny is going to be there no matter what. And, when you're going to travel there, you should take that into consideration. What are you bringing with you? How sensitive is the information that you have? If you have an expectation that it will be revealed, then you can control what you bring. That's an important take-home message.
But, and maybe just for additional context for the current operating environment, if we're talking about U.S. businesses or academic organizations or other individuals who are traveling to China for work or even for personal purposes, appreciating that the landscape has changed a little bit in China since leader Xi Jinping came into power in 2012 and 2013 timeframe. The operating environment has shifted, right?
Yeah. It's a lot more. It's the security focus. We also have to keep in mind, the Chinese Communist Party really wants to remain in power and have a very stable society, and the resources to do that are vast. And so Xi Jinping has been a lot more focused on maintaining that order. And their capability to do so is dramatically improved. Like they've put in not just the resources in terms of manpower, but also incorporating technology and really like merging the digital build out of their economy with that security state.
And prioritizing increasingly national security even at the expense of economic profitability and growth. We all want to be both secure and economically profitable, but if we're looking at the racking and stacking of priorities in the current Chinese system, there does seem to be a real emphasis on national security and domestic stability and security, even sometimes at the expense of attracting foreign direct investment. And so we're seeing that affecting U.S. businesses that are operating there.
People used to ask me all the time, like, what changed? It used to be that everybody was getting along and things seemed to be pretty predictable and stable, and everybody just wanted to make a lot of money. And then things sort of changed, like maybe in the middle of the last decade, right? So, Mary, maybe you could, talk to us a little bit more about that, about sort of like the changes that happened. And honestly, like the situation is just not what it once was. I think we could all agree on that at the very least.
Yes, I think we all certainly agree here, and I imagine most
hopefully the public
listening.
too.
We've got a lot of direct flights a day that are bringing people back and forth, and most people who travel to China either for work or personal purposes do so with a good trip and some good meals over in China and some good cultural experiences and hopefully a visit to the Great Wall, and then they come back home. But what has changed? Well, let's start with maybe kind of around the pre-COVID, the 2020 timeframe. The Chinese government introduced, for example, an initiative which sought to elevate scrutiny of foreign firms operating in China. And this initiative was under the State Administration for Market Regulation, one of the many components of the Chinese apparatus that we're talking about. And initially, the initiative sought to just make sure that foreign firms operating in China, American or otherwise, were staying away from the really sensitive stuff, really sensitive social surveys or business consulting or operating in certain areas in China that were a little bit more off limits to foreigners and to too much public scrutiny. But since then, we've seen a real evolution in how that initiative has been applied, as we know. And so starting in like the spring 2023 timeframe, we started to see U.S. and other foreign firms have their offices visited by Chinese authorities, by that state apparatus that you're talking about, right?
Right, yeah.
And we saw a number of U.S. firms caught up in that, Capvision, Mint, Spain, others. And that really, I think, elevated the concerns among industry and resulted in you getting questions almost daily of, Can I travel to China or not? We got a lot of calls even at the FBI and over at some of our government partner agencies of, can and should my firm or my academic organization, should we be going to China still? Should we be operating there? What should we be thinking about in terms of risks and considerations? I don't want to have my office raided. I don't want to have my assets stolen. I don't want to have my Chinese staff detained. And so I think that the 2020 initiative, but then the evolution of the initiative since then, that 2020 initiative to further scrutinize foreign firms in China, but then that evolution since has really changed the operating environment and changed the questions we're getting daily.
It was the 2024 counter-espionage law, right? That it started to make business information national security sensitive. And I think what was really difficult, especially for U.S. firms at the time, is they didn't know where that line was. What was, kind of normal acquisition of information for due diligence and understanding what is the business environment there versus where you've gotten into a national security sensitive piece of information. You only really found out when the security service would inform
when you cross that line.
Yeah, when you cross the line. And by then it's too late. I think, though, what we have seen is less of, less, what do I call it, like flashy, arrests or raids or things like that.
Totally agree. So this was, the good news is, and especially the really good news if you are a foreign firm, a U.S. firm or U.S. organization traveling to China is, while this initiative, this enhanced scrutinization of foreign firms and other organizations operating in China has continued under the current Chinese government, we haven't seen the raids and the detentions of China-based staff for foreign firms and the seizure of assets and the abrupt discontinuation of operations for foreign firms in China in the way we were in kind of that early 2023 timeframe.
I think a very important point to note here that I'm sensing from you guys, and I really want to bring out to the public, is that people should be mindful of the geopolitical environment and what's sort of going on in the news, right? That does have impact on how people, security services act and how people are treated. So what you read in the newspapers can actually really affect you yourself. So just be mindful of those issues and, generally on, what's going on. And that might, add a little bit of, a nuance to maybe the decisions that you're making before you're actually, traveling or as you're deciding, what your business operation should look like over in China. But let's talk about exit bans because I know that's a hot topic. Mary, you just brought it up. Do you want to start and maybe start with just telling folks like what is an exit ban? Hopefully a lot of people out there don't know what that is, but it is something that people need to think about.
So these travel restrictions essentially allow the Chinese government to retain people in China who have either come to or trying to travel from or passing through China. These exit bans allow the Chinese government to restrict those individuals in China from departing. And
so they're not like going to jail necessarily. They just can't leave.
Totally. And that's a really important distinction. Okay. You're absolutely right, Josh, because we're not talking about formal indictments here or detentions. There's not necessarily even a formal charge that goes with these exit bans. In fact, usually the Chinese government can issue these bans at very low levels, like a local court or something, even without police authority involvement, can issue these exit bans on individuals in China. So for example, an American who's traveled to China for business purposes, perhaps, that American will get to the airport because there's not a list or some sort of interwebs where you can go and search, am I on an exit ban list or not? So often that American or that foreigner will get to the airport, they'll pull out their plane ticket, plan to leave, plan to go home and watch the Super Bowl or whatever's happened on TV that night. And instead, when the American presents their ticket to the teller at the window, that American finds out you are not allowed to leave. That is when that American learns that they are exit banned. So that the Chinese government has issued a notification that says this American cannot leave China until some sort of situation is resolved. Often exit bans get levied for kind of low-level civil or commercial disputes, but also for national security reasons or telecom fraud reasons, or just somebody is part of an investigation. Maybe they're a witness or they're some sort of expert who can help to provide color or context. There are over 12 laws, I think, you're probably counting this, but over at least 12 laws in China right now that authorize Chinese authorities to use exit bans. So these travel restrictions, whether it's on Americans or Chinese nationals, they're pretty flexible in what they allow the government to do. And the net for Americans, for example, who are thinking of traveling to China, is just knowing that there is a potentiality, low as it may be, that you, for whatever any of these myriad civil dispute, commercial dispute, national security, telecom, investigatory reasons, this ban could be levied on you. But as you point out, it's not a detention. In general, people who are exit banned can move freely within China. They just can't leave. Hey, Patrick, if you were traveling to China and you needed to get in touch with the State Department, how would you do so?
So
that's a good question. Thank you.
So you would contact the local consular office and you can use the internet to find out where that is and the best way to contact them.
Probably all information you should have on your person when you are traveling in the first place.
Yes. If you can prepare before you go, you should definitely do that.
And specifically American Citizen Services
right. Yes.
At the embassy in Beijing or one of the consulates throughout the country.
Right.
The U.S. Embassy in Beijing.
And so the other hard part is to figure out where is that dispute. Is it at the local level, like a business transaction that has not been completely fulfilled, or is this something up at the national level where for whatever reason Beijing has decided that they do not want this American returning home? I think that range leaves a lot of gaps to the person who's directly affected.
But if we're talking specific numbers to the extent that we do or don't have them, and you're right, Josh, it is concerning if we don't know our job for the FBI, protect the American people, uphold the Constitution, that applies to Americans both at home and abroad. So it's important that we keep tabs on our people,
right,
and make sure they're safe and secure and that they can come home when they want to come home.
Not necessarily just military service. I want people to, I think government service in general is probably another
current or former
issue.
employment or association.
Yeah. The other features, I think, if you're doing a lot of business in China, you have more opportunities for that business dispute to happen. So, pay attention to that. Make sure you're also following all of the laws in China. Those are the main features.
And just for the double click in the vernacular, but if we're talking about which specific businesses, and I think we've seen a real, at least recently, scrutiny of certain types of foreign industries in China. So due diligence, business consulting, financial accounting,
right,
legal advising, or journalism, always journalism. But some of those more sensitive fields, individuals, if we're talking about profiles, individuals associated with those sorts of industries may be at elevated risk of enhanced scrutiny from the Chinese government, and whether that scrutiny results in an exit ban or just maybe a little bit more attention during the visit, or
right,
an interview upon arrival or departure at the airport, or that sort of interaction. I think certain individuals, what we've seen is individuals associated with certain types of industries, such as those, seem to be getting more attention for now.
And what about like on the non-governmental organization space? Folks maybe who are not in business necessarily, but they're working at an NGO or an academic. I would venture to guess that, for example, people who are focused on issues that are particularly sensitive for the Chinese government might be, might want to be careful, right? So there's a good list of those that are out there. And I don't know if you want to talk about that or just more generally about that space.
He's the recovering academic, so.
Okay.
I think, so a key point that you were bringing up that I think is important, and this calls back to our original explanation of what makes China different. It's the CCP having information control, right? So if your academic research or your business deals in information and access to information, that is something that the government considers sensitive, right? So if you broker in information, deal in information, or you're acquiring information, that is a place where you might experience more sensitivity. And it wouldn't necessarily jump straight to exit ban, or in the situations where they're using that counter-espionage law, where you'd actually be detained. But that would sensitize the security service to look into what information you're accessing in China and how would that affect China's stability.
I think maybe this is a good point to talk about some other concerns that are not necessarily as intrusive as a detention or an exit ban, but perhaps more in the surveillance side of things. Right. You've mentioned already, Patrick, that China has a very robust security state. It's also an autocratic state where individual liberties are not protected like they are here in the United States. So these services have far more power, frankly, to go about their business. Far more power than what you would experience certainly in the United States and in other sort of like-minded countries to us. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So you should have no expectation of privacy in China, and that the state has, one, they have the capability, like they're a very sophisticated security service with like technical apparatus to figure out where you are, when you are, all the time. Right. To get into your system. They can do that should they choose to. In addition to the capability, there is a desire for particular things. You can look at Chinese national plans to understand what are they interested in. First and foremost, like we pointed out earlier, the stability of the state, no social unrest, and Chinese Communist Party maintaining power. If you threaten any of those, the security services are very, very interested. Then there's also things about the economy that they're really interested in. They want to build out a high technology state they have this concept of dual circulation that would make the rest of the world dependent on China and China interdependent. So any of the technologies that they are putting a lot of resources and effort into, you are probably of more interest to the security state than somebody who deals in selling frisbees or something like that.
Okay. I like frisbees better.
And since we're talking about this, maybe we should talk a little bit about espionage, which was not exactly the topic here, but nevertheless, if you're traveling overseas to China, it's possible maybe that somebody from the intelligence services might want to talk to you about what you do in order to learn more information. Do you have any more insight on that, or thoughts you might want to share with the public about that type of issue?
It's a good question, and it happens. As Patrick pointed out, China's intelligence and security services do have a broad remit. There is a whole kind of series of laws that have been introduced since about the 2014 timeframe, when the Chinese government introduced its first major national security law, and then subsequent layering of laws since: cybersecurity laws, personal privacy laws, NGO laws, and the enhanced counter-espionage law of 2024. And so the Chinese authorities really do have a lot of remit and a lot of tools and capabilities that allow the Chinese authorities to do things like, when foreigners travel to China, to either at the airport or not at the airport, ask for a meeting, ask to engage, ask for a secondary interview, ask for an invitation to tea, whatever it may be.
Yes, the invitation to tea.
When we go, is that we know that we're under the authorities of, and we are subject to the norms of the country. And so in the case of China, if we're foreigners traveling to China, yes, there is a not insignificant chance that we will have interaction with Chinese authorities. That is just the way the laws work. That's the way the environment works. And that's part of the way the Chinese government currently enables domestic stability and security. And so what does that mean on a practical level for us? As long as we're following those laws that you mentioned, Patrick, and as long as we're in compliance with everything, what we have filled out our Chinese visa properly, please don't lie. Don't lie. That we have been forthcoming with the Chinese authorities prior to travel to China. While there, we don't try to do anything that's going to really attract extra attention. We're really mindful that, for example, in China, taking pictures of Chinese government installations, even seemingly innocuous ones, or Chinese officials, Chinese police getting too close to protest events, getting involved in the protest events, taking pictures, all of these activities that in the United States we might think of as First Amendment protected rights, or as kind of just good fodder for Instagram, not so much in China. And so really being mindful of what some of the local customs and laws are, and trying to minimize our chances of having those interactions with Chinese authorities. But it can really happen.
I want to tease that out a little bit more. You're talking, I think, about some, precautions perhaps that people should take. So is there more you want to add to that? And, somebody who's listening to this or watching it, what should they do? Is there like a checklist of additional things that you think that they should take into account prior to travel?
I think,
or even in making a decision as to whether to travel or not.
Yeah, I think that, if you're going to go into China, and that includes Hong Kong as far as we're concerned, then try not to take the electronics that you hold near and dear to your heart, because as soon as you cross those borders, they will have all of the opportunity to get into those electronics. So if you can bring a laptop that is dedicated to travel and only gets used for travel purposes, that's great. If you can use a cell phone that's not your personal cell phone, but a different one, that's great. That's an easy precaution to take so that you do not get digitally, pulled into the Chinese security state, and that doesn't carry back with you. So that's an easy primary precaution to take.
And also making sure if, for example, an American is traveling for work to China, whether that's to mainland China, Hong Kong, or Macau these days, to make sure that American has worked with his or her employer or organization or prior to travel, and made sure that, for example, if I'm going to go and I'm going to try to log into a laptop and log back into my home server to do my work as I'm sitting in my Hong Kong hotel room, making sure I've worked with my employer in advance, that we've got secure connect, and that we make sure we know what's available if I'm logging in or not, and just taking the appropriate digital security precautions so that we don't end up inadvertently compromising some of our employers' sensitive informations or creating open channels back to our home servers.
Yeah, or definitely, consider maybe not doing that until you get into a territory.
Email can wait.
Yeah, exactly.
I think, we would also agree that State Department has a good list of resources that are available, and people should be mindful of whatever information they are putting out there.
State.travel, I think, and you can just filter for China or whatever your destination is.
Very easy to find. Yeah. And we have additional information as well up on our website as well, fbi.gov. You could, research more information about China.
And maybe while you're mentioning the State Department resources, keep in mind STEP, S-T-E-P, the acronym for State Department, going to the State Department website. All Americans are encouraged to register with State Department's STEP page prior to travel. The benefit to the Americans who register then is we, the U.S. government, know where you are. We can help give you updates if there's a changing political circumstance or natural disaster that happens in the place where you American overseas are. But we can only know that if the American registers with STEP. So that's another great resource.
Right.
All right. Final thoughts?
Always check the travel advisory before you go. Right now we're at travel advisory level 2, which is, safe,
careful.
But be careful. Which I hope we have conveyed, and work these kind of security ideas into your plan. Really think about, is this travel, are you in those categories that might be under scrutiny, might have a greater expectation of a problem? If so, is there another way you can do this? Can you meet in Singapore? Can you meet in the UAE? Can you meet in any other country that has a good relationship with China to do business and a track record of doing so? If your business has another office in another location, like that's if you feel like there's a big risk, consider all these alternatives.
Okay.
I guess just to layer onto that is where you start at the top, Josh. We want and need kind of bilateral interaction between the United States and China. And that includes starting with people-to-people relations, whether that's commercial interaction or academic interaction or just cultural exchange, learning about each other. That's the way that the world works and stays stable. So we're not saying, I don't think any of us has said Americans or other foreigners don't travel to China. It's just understanding the current context and the current environment in China when doing so and being respectful of the rules and laws and local norms, but also appreciating that the risk considerations for each individual traveling to China are not equal. And so thinking about, am I an American from a certain sensitive industry, business consulting, due diligence, legal advising, et cetera, that we talked about? Am I somebody with maybe a slightly elevated profile for attracting Chinese government attention? Maybe I have historical or cultural or ethnic ties to China, or I'm former or current U.S. government to include, but not exclusive of military, or I am somebody associated with one of those sensitive industries. And thinking about kind of within that framework of risks and considerations, should I travel or not? Is now a good time to go? And when I do travel, what precautions can I take prior to travel and while in country, using some of those State Department resources, using some of that digital hygiene checklist that Patrick mentioned, and then deciding based on all of those factors, that cost-benefit analysis we're all taught to do when we're in lower school, but that same idea of then do we want to go or not? And I think the challenge here is the choice is a little bit binary. For the vast majority of people when they go, they're going to have a great trip, they're going to get their work done,
yep.
Maybe skip the email, because why not skip email? Right. and then they're going to come back on time. But the binary part of it is that for that select few, there can be real elevated scrutiny and consequences associated up to and including things like raids and exit bans. So really just making sure that any individual who's traveling thinks about that risk consideration calculation. And if we're an industry or an academic organization, trying to apply that same risk calculation on maybe more of a systemic level.
Well, to sum up, let's go back to the beginning with that question that we started with. Can I do business in China? Can I go to China? Can I travel in China? Unfortunately, I think the answer really is it depends. We've, I think, today given you all a lot of different issues to consider when you're making that decision. And at the end of the day, it's really a decision that you have to make yourself. Obviously here, we in the FBI and in the United States government will do our utmost to protect you, regardless of what happens. But we really depend on you, the American public, to make a proper and informed decision for yourselves. With that, I really want to thank Mary and Patrick for joining me today. It was really lovely being able to have a conversation with you two, which doesn't happen as much as I would like. So maybe we could do this again sometime. And I also would really like to thank you, the American public, for hopefully watching this entire video all the way through and for your attention today. I hope it was helpful to you. Thanks again.